we'll just be talking about how's the implementation going.
This has been a very challenging week. We started out the week spending a couple of days with 500 experts on foster youth and 70 foster youth. And we gave talks about foster youth. So it was, they knew more than we did. And here we are again with a whole bunch of policymakers who know a lot about the LCFF, and so we're going to talk about the LCFF. So my strategy has been to take the non-controversial parts of the presentation and present those, and then give Julie Kopic the opportunity to present the rest. So we did something sort of unusual for researchers. We wanted to make sure that we got out into the field as quickly as we could and got back and got information to policymakers in a timely fashion. And this is particularly challenging when you have a dozen researchers on your team and from all sorts of different organizations. But everybody got all of it done on time. And we did this main report, which is purposefully a very short research brief. We wanted people to read it. And so we figured 10 pages is probably about right. And you can find this report Stewart Foundation's website or at SRI.com, and you type in LCFF and you'll see 3 reports. We piggybacked that initial round of research to do two other reports. First with, I should say, most importantly, the Stewart Foundation generously supported that first effort, and really thanks to those folks. It was really meaningful work for us, and so we really enjoyed doing it. Then the National Center for Youth Law and the Walter S. Johnson Foundation said, let's piggyback on what you've already learned and add a little bit to it. And so we took a closer look at foster youth and the LCAPs. And similarly, the Heising-Simons Foundation asked us to take a closer look at early childhood and the LCFF. And so those 3 reports are all out there. You can read them. And I'm really going to focus on the first one, but I may throw in and Julie will throw in a little bit of what we learned from these other efforts. So our research questions were really basic. What's going on out there? We were particularly interested in the public engagement piece. We thought that was likely to be a big challenge, and so we did pay a lot of attention to that. We started the study, though, by going around Sacramento and talking to people and saying, what do you need to know? What should we be asking about? And so that was an important part of what we did. I won't bore you with all of our methods, but they were pretty straightforward. We wanted to go deep in some districts, so we were in 10 different districts, but we really wanted to get some sort of representativeness, and so we made an effort to do telephone interviews with a large number of county offices, and as well as in-person office interviews with district offices. And we looked at piles and piles of paper. And we had a report out in early October. So, I think the summary finding is probably this one. People out there in the school districts and the county offices, the people that we talk to are really excited about this. They're very enthusiastic. They feel like this is the most important thing that's happened in the state for a long, long time, and they really welcome it. In the foster youth community, it's interesting. They're particularly excited about this because, frankly, that's an invisible population, and to have the state name it and really forcing everybody to sort of focus on this group. What are their particular needs? So the foster youth community is quite excited, and especially because this is a group of kids who have the very lowest outcomes, both academic and social outcomes, life outcomes, of any of the groups in the state. And so it's high time that they get the attention. And then early childhood community is just sort of getting around to getting involved in the LCAPs. There are some issues there for them, but they are starting to see a real opportunity there as well. And so there's some tensions. And those tensions are really about what we heard earlier from Chris. Please don't screw this up. There was, almost to a person, there's a genuine fear that the state is going to come in and fix it before it's had time to mature. And particularly after their first year of experience with this, if you were in a district and you were working on this, or you were in a county office, you saw an incredibly compressed timeline to get all of this work done. And people were enthusiastic but exhausted. I mean, we got to them right after they'd finished their LCAP, and they had been running full blast for the last 3 months, trying to get meaningful community engagement, trying to really develop a plan that spoke to their community, and they knew to a person that they hadn't gotten it quite right yet, that they needed more time. I think that one thing I would add is that as we dug down a little bit, we found some other issues related to these worries for the specific groups. And I think it's unfortunate that we haven't had a chance yet to look at English language learners, because I have a feeling that there's some real specific issues there. And we plan to do that. But with the foster youth population, one of the things that we found was that by and large, we've got a problem at the state level by not having really a comprehensive data system. We don't really, districts don't really know who their foster youth are. CalPads is working on getting the count right, but right now we have an undercount in the state. And even if we get that right, we don't have the kind of information about the kids' educational histories that we really need to properly serve them. And similarly, most districts don't disaggregate by foster youth, and so we actually don't know what the expulsion rate is, for example, for foster youth. But I can tell you it's very high. So similarly, on the early childhood side, there is a bit of a split in the early childhood community about whether we actually want the K-12 system to run us. And so there has been some hesitancy to get actively involved, but I think that's starting to change. The other thing is that districts sometimes look at early childhood and say, oh, well, you're still a categorical. So, you're all taken care of. And so there's a lot of work to be done to really educate districts about the importance of, and in their interest to serve young children. So all that's non-controversial, and now Julie's going to take on the bad stuff.
Thanks. It's good to have a partner. It's not all bad, but it does. I think that these findings alter a bit the complexion of some of the discussion that has preceded this presentation. So given the limitations of time, I'm going to dispense with the niceties and just head into the nitty-gritty of our findings. One of the things that was most interesting to us, and actually quite positive about the LCFF, is it's beginning in many districts to change the way districts construct budgets. Some of our districts actually began from what do we need rather than what can we afford. In other words, what kinds of programs and services, supports and services are good for kids and useful for teachers, rather than beginning from how much money do we have and what will that money buy. Not all did it. Some districts were simply relieved that this was the first year in many when they were not laying off teachers and cutting programs, and they chose to use their dollars this year to restore some things that they believe needed to be there but had been cut. But almost all districts that we examined engaged in a new kind of budget development, in that we found cross-program conversations about how much money should be spent to do whatever the district's priorities were, and we found conversations between budget offices and program offices. That was new. Districts were no longer constrained by the categorical restrictions. They began to have more wide-ranging conversations about how to spend money that was newly flexible, and how to set priorities with these newly flexible dollars. And I think this is a big deal in California. Now we'll get to LCAPs. So LCAPs have been ballyhooed as this great vehicle. In some cases, that is correct. But I would say in other cases, LCAPs in the first year of implementation are a bit of a cautionary tale and something from which all of us collectively can learn a lot. To reinforce, there is no question but the districts did not have enough time to do LCAPs well. And given the amount of time they had, they need to be applauded for their seriousness of purpose, for how well they tried to do this very hard and very different work. However, they were faced with a rather defeating LCAP template for a whole lot of reasons. The template itself drove them a little mad. The State Board of Ed has now altered that template. I'm looking at Carl. And we hope to get an opportunity.
Not on anymore.
And we hope to get an opportunity to go back and talk with some of these places and find out whether the altered template, in fact, made a difference. Districts were very eager to tell their stories. What are we doing? We're excited about what we're doing, but they didn't necessarily think the LCAP template gave them an opportunity to do that. There remained in this first year of implementation a lot of confusion about what should go into the LCAP. Is it just state funds? Is it particular district funds? Do we include federal funds? How do we account for supplemental and concentration grants for the targeted groups of students? How do we list these? What do we do? That confusion was compounded by the fact that the state's budget reporting document is geared for categorical programs, not for LCFF, a problem that clearly the state needs to solve. We know they're working on it. I think there's probably no easy resolution. I think that if the state intends, as I believe it does, that the LCAPs serve not only as a tool to develop priorities and build budgets, but also as a way to communicate with broader communities about what districts are doing, the first round did not pass the 7-Eleven test. 7-Eleven test, you stand outside a 7-Eleven with your LCAP. You let anybody who walks by, a parent, a community member, read it and say, so do you know what we're doing? The answer would be generally not so much. So that was the first year of LCAPs. Many districts did, again, admirable jobs, a very tough job, lots of work to be done. County offices of ed, as you all know, have a really crucial role to play in the LCFF. They not only have to approve or require modifications in the LCAPs, but they also have provided some technical assistance to districts. In particularly, it was through county offices that districts came to understand what a model of a combined, a cross-program and combined budget office, fiscal program, budget development process would look like. The counties were particularly grateful to SECESA for the guidance that that organization provided, and we heard over and over again, without that, we really would have been wandering in the LCFF wilderness. But this is going to be a work in progress for county offices as well. They had to do a whole lot more work with very few resources. It meant that in some county offices they suspended the work they were involved in on Common Core so that they could get the LCAP approval going and the LCAP technical assistance going. And for county offices, I think at least as much as for districts, this is a cultural shift. LCFF is a cultural shift. County offices also are used to thinking in terms of categorical programs. Meaningful public engagement is the next, actually the last area that we pursued. It is important enough that you'll just have to believe me, I have 2 slides on it, not just one. So there was, in the places we visited, the districts and county office folks we talked with, enthusiasm for public engagement. Not a reluctance, but a, yep, parents and other stakeholders ought to be involved, they ought to be engaged, they ought to help us figure out how to spend money, what's important to their kids. Having said that, community engagement was a little difficult for most places, for the reason that it's a community organizing effort. That's what the community engagement part is. School districts, by and large, do not have community organizing skills, nor perhaps should they. So we found that in the districts that brought in outside agencies that in fact were used to community organizing, knew how to do it, it was those districts that engaged the widest swath of parents. But in districts that didn't, by and large, they used a variety of well-intentioned strategies, community meetings and surveys and lots of things, but in fact, they acknowledged that the parents who were engaged in LCAP development were the parents one might have suspected would have been engaged in LCAP development. We found that although the law calls for educator involvement, teachers and principals were not very involved in LCAP development. Generally, they were told, oh, by the way, we're having a community meeting on this night, feel free to attend. A couple of principals said to us, well, gee, I first learned about this when somebody told me we needed to use the auditorium for something I'd never heard of and a reason I hadn't approved. That's how they learned about it. Again, stressing that reaching the parents, guardians, those interested in the, was it the right one?
Yeah.
Okay. Those who are concerned about the target populations, low-income kids, foster youth, English language learners, that was just a tough slog. Districts have to learn to do it better. They're not going to be able to learn to do it better on their own. There's going to need to be some help. The other thing that we found very interesting was local control accountability. Local control for most districts meant district control, not school control. Whether it will transfer to schools get to have more say over how dollars are allocated or what kinds of decisions are made remains to be seen. We even found a couple of districts in which principals had a great deal of budget autonomy that was yanked back because of the local control accountability formula. I think not what was intended, but an unintended consequence. So I think we leave these 3 studies with cautious optimism. As Dan said, there's great enthusiasm for the LCFF. There are a lot of good intentions. There's been a lot of good and hard work. But we should not kid ourselves. This is indeed a work in progress. There are emerging promising practices. There are models that districts should have an opportunity to view, and hopefully the state will provide a mechanism so that districts that have invented interesting ways of doing things can share what they've done with others. But these are early days, and I'd end with the note on which we began. If you ask districts what their biggest fear was about the LCF, it wasn't about getting budgeting right. It wasn't about choosing the right programs. It wasn't about improving student achievement, and it wasn't about engaging parents. It was that the state would come in and make big changes before they had a chance to even try to get it right.
The PTA has been very active in educating parents and explaining to them about LCFF and LCAPs, and I have been traversing the state the last 2 years, or it seems like longer, but it might only be that, talking and listening to parents and talking and listening with districts and administrators, principals, and teachers. And there's some really great, awesome things, wonderful, that are happening in school districts and in counties, and some not so. And we hear a lot about that. We hear a lot when I'm listening to parents and they're saying, yeah, I heard from my school district. I don't understand what they're talking about. What is a COE? What is a CDE? What is an LCAP? What is an assessment? They don't understand any of that. And when we were first out doing our training and we were trying to talk about, we no longer have these categoricals and this is what that meant. And now we have this and this is what that meant. And parents would be like just sitting there totally blind, and we realized, oh, well, all the people at PTA were all once really active parents, right, who were policy wonks, and they ended up as advocates for the state PTA because that's where parent policy wonks end up. And we were even talking not in clear language to our own parents, right? So when we could scale that back and spend a lot of time talking about what is it that you're worried about? What is it that you want for your children? What is it that will make the difference for you to make sure your child shows up every day at school? And that's a different conversation. And it's a kind of an interesting conversation because we have very interestingly diverse populations in California and in some school districts and in some counties. And what I have noticed most is parents have two things. Matter of fact, we all do because we're people, most of us are, is that we are motivated by fear and we are motivated by love, right? And parents' worst fear is that their children aren't going to get what they need and they're going to live with them forever, or they're not going to be able to get a good job. And they're motivated by love that, don't you see how my child is gifted, they're an Olympian, they're going to be on The Voice, and that's my child, it's the greatest thing, and you should love my child like I do. And those are the two motivators for parents, and they really are. And so when we're communicating and we're listening with them, and they're saying, well, what I want to get out of this is my child is feeling like they want to go to school. My child is engaged. My child's an artist and they see art. My child is interested in science and they see science. And so we're trying to help them talk with districts, administrators, and principals in language that's clear and understandable for both sides, which is also very interesting. In some areas, it's very easy to get your folks, your parents, especially in middle-class schools, who want to make sure their kids are going to go on to four-year universities or higher-level tech training. You want to make sure that they want to be at those meetings, right? They want to be there because you have to know how valuable their child is. But for a lot of other areas, and I know in my own community and the work that I do, is parents sometimes in other more diverse communities or lower socioeconomic, it's really scary to go to the school. It's scary. It's not like anything they know. They maybe don't speak the language. They're not comfortable with their own education. And in those areas, you need to go to where the parents are. We always have to meet parents where they are on the landscape of understanding education, and then also where do we go. So in those communities, where do I go? I go to the laundromat, and I bring books. Books to just stick on a shelf. Child is in the laundromat, reading the book, talking to the child about the book, asking the mom, in my horrible Spanish usually, what is it you want for your kid? And we start talking and we start working out our language barrier, and we create a connection, and I say, you should be going to your school, or this is how we can help you. And that is meeting parents where they are, and that's really, I think, a prime importance. The other thing I think that's really imperative, and this is the hardest thing to do, I mean, it's the hardest thing to do in our society, it's the hardest thing to do in our world, is explaining to parents on each side of the divide why equity is important. To the folks that have, why it's good to share, right? We all learned that in preschool, sharing is good. Why that's good, and on this side, that there are people that want to help. mean, that is a big divide that is very hard to breach. And PTA does some of that work. Some of the ways we do that work is with this incredibly wonderful program we have, some of you may know, called School Smarts, which is a parent engagement academy. And it helps parents come together as small groups within their school community to understand each other, to understand the school and how it works from just their classroom all the way up to LCFF and LCAP, why their voice is important, and how to make an action plan. It is a great opportunity to engage not only for the parent to understand what's happening within the school and their child, but to create those communities that are really vital to LCFF and LCAP working well, and for people in the education world to be able to draw parents in and get all that diverse information. So I would encourage that. I would also encourage parent engagement. It's not the tick box. Oh, I talked to 3 parents out of my 45,000. Boom, parent engagement done. It's something that's got to be embedded. I mean, and it's embedded with teachers, and it's embedded with a principal. And for, I would encourage even district personnel, do you want to know what's happening? Go to pickup at any school and go down the line of cars, and everybody who's picking up kids will tell you what's going on because they know. Because they're all talking about it while they're picking up kids. That's a great way to learn a lot of information, or on the playground, or those kinds of things. It's really hard to learn all that in an office. So I would encourage that kind of engagement. The PTA has a long-standing history of advocacy and supporting kids, especially kids that are underserved, especially kids that need assistance, because really they're just all our kids. They're all our kids, and we want to make sure that they're successful. And we also have, and I think some of you might have had it or seen it, and it's available, which is our PTA National Standards for Family and School Partnerships Assessment Guide. It's on our website, capta.org. It is a fabulous, easy-to-follow guide that shows what good parent engagers you are, so I want to encourage that. And then my last shameless plug is I'd like to encourage you all to join PTA. Your $10 membership makes all these things accessible, and we give these information and we share information with everybody who is a parent, not just our members, but your support supports that.
I am a teacher. I was struck at the last panel, Angela was talking about the size of the room and the number of the folks in here, and it's a lot bigger than her classroom. I'm an art teacher. I would say this is probably equivalent to the size of my room. I've been fortunate to be able to kind of take a couple different perspectives on the LCAP process. When I'm a teacher, at a high school, an urban high school. My district has about 18 comprehensive high schools. We have about 25 sites altogether. We encompass the entire city of Bakersfield and surrounding communities. We have 37,000 students. We're about 67% unduplicated pupil. My school is the second highest concentration of unduplicated pupils in the district. And the district encompasses urban, rural, and suburban areas. So we have a big, we're a big microcosm of the state. Going through the LCAP process, of course, last year was crazy. There was a very truncated time period, and the district really had to scramble to kind of get everything in place and try to get an LCAP out by the deadline. They did make a good effort in trying to get stakeholder the information from stakeholders in regards to the LCAP. And since this year they've done an even better job, I think, of holding LCAP forums. They've put together an LCAP advisory committee in which the association is part of. And by the way, I'm the vice president of our local teachers association as well, and I also have to get a state perspective because I'm a CTA liaison to the State Board of Education. So I've been able to kind of see the LCAP from these different perspectives. So the district did a really good job in acquiring a lot of information. They did it in several different ways, and they put out a survey. They had a parent survey, a teacher survey, just a variety of surveys. So the information that came into the district is a lot. But one issue that's kind of remained is that the people who actually are interpreting that data has not been very varied. The folks who are actually writing the LCAP and the folks who are actually looking at the data and are basically saying, this is what this data means, those folks are all they're all under the superintendent. So there really isn't any community groups. There's no parents. There's no teachers. Those folks aren't in that room during the actual writing of that LCAP. But that's been a big issue of mine. And again, I don't think there's anything malicious here. I really don't. I think it's a perspective issue, and I think it's a structural and cultural issue. I think the folks who are working in the central office are doing their job the only way that they know how to do their job. And this is their frame, and this is their perspective, and they're trying to get that work done in a way that they feel is going to be done well. But they lack the perspective. Again, I'm an art teacher, and I do teach perspective. I teach linear perspective. And one thing I like to do with my kids is they'll all be sitting around the room. I put an object in the middle of the room, and I ask them what they see. I go over to one side of the room and I tell the kid, "What do you see?" And he tells me what he sees. And I go to the other side of the room and tell him, "What do you see?" And he tells me what he sees. Right? And I go over and the same thing. So everybody in that room is looking at the same object, but everybody in that room sees the object differently. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that they're seeing a different piece of that object. And when we kind of collaborate and we bring all our information together, we get a truer image of what that object actually is. And I think that's where we need to go in regards to the LCAP formation. I think we need to get to a point where everybody's voice is being heard, and everybody's voice is actually being included in this. And I don't think we're there yet. I think I have really high hopes for this. I think having this in place is a big step forward. I do see the district reaching out to community members who they've never reached out to before, in ways that they've never been able to do before. As the vice president of my association, I see teachers' unions reaching out to community groups and to parents in ways that I have not seen those local unions do before. As part of the Kern High School Teachers Association, we reached out, and we've actually become a part of the Kern Educational Justice Collaborative in Bakersfield, which encompasses the Dolores Huerta Foundation. In fact, Dolores Huerta actually sits on the committee, and she's there during the meetings. And we have Greater Bakersfield Legal Assistance, Rural Legal Assistance. We have Faith in Action. We have a variety of community groups. We've just recently included the LGBT community. But it's a different perspective. It's a different view on student needs and education. And it's coming outside of the classroom, which I think is important. And I think I'm the liaison under that committee. And for me, I think it's been beneficial in two ways. First of all, these folks are coming from a perspective outside of education. So they're not privy to a lot of the ed policy. They're not privy to all the classroom dynamics that are occurring. So it helps having me in there with them, so when they come up with some ideas, I can add to it by including my perspective, the classroom teacher perspective or the ed policy perspective. At the same time, having conversations with them has kind of pulled our association to take a different view. Rather than always continuously looking just at issues of salary, benefits, working conditions, and those kind of issues, I think having conversations and having a real relationship with these groups pulls us over so that we actually start looking at those things by putting students in the center. And I think that is important. I think when you bring it back to the students are the main thing here, and what's going to improve teaching and learning, then I think you start to get shifts, whether in these institutions, whether you're talking about the teachers union, or you're talking about the district office, or you're talking about these community social justice groups. So I think it's been beneficial. I think where we are now compared to where we were a couple of years ago is much, much better. We're in a better place. But I do think that we need to change. We need to continue to evolve. Another issue too that I've noticed is I've got the highest concentration of unduplicated pupils in my school in the district. You have this LCAP money that's coming in, and then you're seeing it. The big issue is class size reduction. So you guys thought I was joking about that classroom thing, huh? But class size reduction is a pretty huge issue. But then you start seeing how's the money being spent across the district in regards to class size reduction. I tell you, the second highest concentration in my district, we just lost a teacher, and we had additional funds. So that's an issue, right? That doesn't mean that I'm against this notion of district flexibility. I'm for it. In fact, I spoke to it at the state board. I was number 307. So I think that districts do need flexibility. Districts do need flexibility in order to be creative. But at the same time, I think there is an onus on districts to look at equity and not just say equity means equal, because it doesn't. And I think there's an onus on teachers' unions also to stand up for students and say, look, we're going to advocate for kids and make sure that these equity issues are falling back. So I think it's an opportunity for all of us to kind of take a new direction, continue to evolve. But again, the onus is on to make sure that we don't fall back to where we used to be, and make sure that we're evolving in a place that's going to end up with a better outcome for teaching and learning and for kids.
This is going to be the highly unlikely example of LAUSD that I'm going to bring to you of collaboration and using LCFF as essentially a platform for that to happen. It's essentially sort of a story, I think, that covers three major points. The first is the idea that LCFF was a minimum mandate, right? And that there is a lot of room for local creativity for how it would be implemented and actually played out at the school level. The second is that I think there are really exciting opportunities for uncommon alliances. And by that I mean thinking about how unions and charters and reform groups might actually think about linking arms. The last is also that LCFF, and I think a lot of your comments actually covered this, allows us a platform to look at what happens both in the classroom as well as out of the classroom and how that all affects teaching and learning. So the first part has to do with what the minimum mandates of the law are. And in LA, I think we started with the premise that LCFF gave us a floor but not a ceiling in terms of how we would think about equity. And so the beginning premise was that the base grant would go out to every single student, every single school, and that made absolute sense because every school and every student had essentially suffered during the years of the recession and massive cuts. The narrative changed when we started to think about supplemental and concentration grants. And LAUSD has very unique demographics. Depending on which count you would use for the target populations of low-income English language learners or foster youth, LAUSD clocks in at anywhere between 80 to 90% of its student population fitting into one of those three categories. And so part of what we were thinking about was how do you prioritize within a population where 90% of the kids are potentially categorized as a high-need population. So what we did at Advancement Project was essentially to create a need index. So we took those three base variables that were dictated by state law, and we layered on an additional 9. So looked at things like third grade reading, access to early learning, high school graduation rates, a couple of more unusual things like rates of gun violence, which also correlates with student learning outcomes, the percentage of asthma absences from school. And essentially what it created was a priority list of 600 schools throughout LAUSD and who should essentially benefit first from the supplemental and concentration grant. Beyond that, the coalition of the willing that we enlisted to actually work on this, because this was not by any stretch of the imagination something that everyone is expecting from LCFF. This was a very different sort of interpretation of it. But what was really exciting about it was that we had a number of CBOs that I think had been largely aligned with the charter movement. We had UTLA, which is our local teachers union, also in support. We had business groups come out in support of it. And we had school board members who I think traditionally they see themselves as union school board members or charter school board members. And we got a 6 out of 7 vote in favor of it, which was incredibly exciting and unprecedented. I don't think they've actually had a single 6-7 vote otherwise at LUSD. The other thing that was really interesting is that the mix of interventions that were recommended, though not mandated, for the school site level were a mix of things that were in classroom and out of classroom. And this was, I think, very compelling and powerful to have teachers say, we need nurses, we need social workers, we need psychiatric counselors, we need foster youth counselors. And it's not terribly fair or even practical to assume that teachers can shoulder that entire load and still be effective teachers. But having the messenger be a teacher, a trusted local person, was incredibly important for school board members, for the superintendent, for the press to actually hear directly that those were things that people in the teaching corps cared about, those were things that students cared about, and those were things that parents certainly cared about. So I think I'll maybe just close with an example of a 10th grader who did public comment in support of the resolution that actually carried this need index. And he got up and he said, LCFF says that I matter, which is just a very poignant sort of distillation of what LCFF says. In particular with the need index, which I think he sort of conflated, understandably and happily, with the need index. But he said, it is harder for kids at my school to learn because when there's a truck that backfires, kids hit the floor, right? And that's about gun violence. It is harder because I miss days because sometimes of smog alerts. It is harder because sometimes my walk to school is not safe because of gangs. And those are very real things that LCFF does not yet contemplate, but things that if you think about local creativity and local conditions, we actually have the power to address.
I'm going to play off something that started when we were listening to the research about one of the big things that's changed, one of the shifts, is this idea in developing a budget, instead of having to think about what we can afford, is what do we need or what do we want. And then go to this idea that we're really trying to gauge the community, not necessarily, the teachers or district administration, but what's living in the community. And Justine, actually, all three of you spoke to this idea that what's living in the community could be very different from what's developing, depending on how the LCAP is developed and what kind of surveys, or how do you bring people together? And so I'm just kind of interested, Justine, if you would, first from you, because I started thinking about this while you were speaking, but what are some options about getting into the community and actually starting to build a narrative based on what's living as opposed to trying to extrapolate from the data what the narrative is? So
again, it's this creative thinking and going out and talking. I live in Ventura County, which is very diverse. Half of the county is very, very economically comfortable, and half of the county is poorer than poor. Half of the county has great influx of money into their schools, and half of the county doesn't. So when you're trying to meet people where they are, or you're trying to do it, in one end of the county, I would use just a simple, you could do a robocall, you could, send out information, you could post it on your website, you could do a tweet, and you could get 300 parents, especially if you said you're going to change the light bulbs and there wasn't practice for sports. I mean, it's that easy. In other parts of the community, it's not so much, and that's where you have to be creative. Where are my families at? Where do I want to talk to them? Is there a community event happening at a local community center or faith, house of faith, or is there something that's happening? I know that I work with a lot of migrant farm workers, and we have a monthly meeting. And that is like the great place for the school district. We invite the school district to come often. They They don't often do that. But you've got 500 parents and 700 kids. Where else would you be getting someone to talk to all the time? So, I mean, you have to think in that way. Teachers and principals, as loaded down as they are, they are someone in that community that's very respected. So to make phone calls or to ask questions, not just, your kid didn't do this, which is, what's happening? Why isn't this happening? I mean, you have to have more of a conversation. So I think that you have to look at the culture of the communities you're serving and communicate to them in a way that builds trust, that says that you're on their side and that you have the best interest of their families. And it would be easy if that were a checkbox.
I wanted to ask, I guess it's Dan and Julia, there's an observation and a question. The observation is, and it's quite clear and I think important, that people don't feel rushed in the next 2 years about LCAP, getting better at it. So that's a good message, I hope, at the state. But the question is this: are you looking at in your research how people can best learn from the LCAP process? So who's learning? What other mechanisms either learn from their own experience or others that are doing it? And is that within your perspective in the next while or not?
We'd like to.
One of the things that we point out in the reporting and some other places is that a key role for the state and for the C squared, E squared is to identify those examples. Who's doing community engagement really well and how do they do it? And it goes across the gamut. So I think that's a really important function of that group.
One of the opportunities that I think is also sort of wanting to happen is that LCFF brings budgets much closer to actual communities and parents than ever before. And I think people are starting to actually have a more palpable sense that there is actually not enough money in the system to do everything that people think public schools should do. And so it sort of takes the wind out of the narrative that it's just money being used inefficiently, but that there's enough money. And that strikes me as not only an opportunity for parent empowerment, engagement, and community engagement, but also to start thinking about what the next revenue source looks like, because people are much more, I think, attuned to how scarce of dollars we would still have even at the full implementation of LCFF with 2008 levels, which is to say that we would not be whole even at full implementation.
Here you talk a little bit about the diverse coalition that you were able to bring together and overcoming the charter dynamic in LA. Actually leads me to a question for Dan. Julia, about, is there anything that we should know, or is there any research being done about how charters experience LCAPF and LCAP that's different or similar from district?
That's really a big need, and Dan and I are part of a group of researchers that's beginning to assemble a list of questions that we think need to be answered, and that's certainly one of them. I'm not aware of research that's going on right now, but it sure needs to be done, yeah.
Julie, I was going to ask you, you had made a comment, I think, to the end of your comments, and thank you all for that, it's so interesting. The comment was that around English learners, around foster youth, that there's still a lot that needs to be done around that, and they really felt that. I wonder if you could elaborate on what you really meant by that, and what you did hear from districts around what they were doing to engage, particularly English learner, disadvantaged youth, foster youth, understanding that, and do you have any observations on that, on what's happening around that area?
What we didn't do was read all the LCAPs. We actually began that process when we began this study and quickly abandoned it because it wasn't giving us the kind of information that we wanted, frankly. We do know that around foster youth, for example, there are some examples, LA being one of them, where attention is being paid either to supplementing supports and services, for example, counselors dedicated to foster youth, and or bringing together the outside of district social service agencies and leveraging those for schools. Around English language learners, our quick view, and reiterate what Dan said, that we've not been able to delve into that category yet. Again, there's some teacher professional development listed in LCAPs, there's some counseling listed, some parent training. So I don't think that our particular work has meant to or has shone a very bright light on precisely what districts are doing. But I think that, again, that would be part of the opportunity of the CCEE or perhaps a group of researchers or perhaps another organization who can answer the kinds of questions about what kind of work is being done for particular student populations.
Yeah, I would just add that, when we did look, and others have looked at the LCAPs, it was awfully difficult to actually see where the dollars were going. And so in the case of foster youth, it was pretty rare that funds or programs were actually specified for foster youth. It was not unusual to have superintendents and district leadership say, well, we've got all these kids who have needs, and so we're going to give all these kids extra tutoring or counseling or whatever. And so I think it's still very much a learning process around what needs to happen for groups like foster youth or ELL, what can happen. I mean, when you work in a district office, you are used to, say you're in charge of the ELL program. You sit at your desk, and the finance director comes over and gives you a yellow sticky and says, here's how much money you have to spend. And that's the way it used to be, and that's the way people are having to shed that kind of culture. And so, I don't want to underestimate how difficult this is going to be. I think that community engagement. I mean, we're going to try deliberative democracy in California. I think it's really challenging, but I do think that it is an unbelievable opportunity. We're redistributing resources, and we are engaging the public, all at the same time. So it's from a researcher perspective, this is heaven.
I have a little comment, and so to get Kim to say a bit more about this process in Los Angeles. It is highly unusual that a group of folks in Los Angeles will actually move the school board to do anything. And you were able to do this, but there's a particular piece that you used that attracted me. You were able to get complex data on one piece of paper.
Yes.
And
a couple pieces of paper.
Yeah. But you had a map.
Yes.
That managed to compress enormous amounts of data and make it understandable. And for the folks in the room that may not know about this, might be edifying if you would say a bit about that.
So part of, I think, what in essence almost depoliticized this conversation was we started with a lot of data. And there's a way in which sort of seemingly, really facially neutral data is kind of unassailable, right? Data is what it is. And if you take, as we did, 12 indexes, 12 variables that we know affect student learning, 3 of which were already accounted for in the state's formulation, and then added on another 9 sort of more LA-specific variables. It gave us a very different picture. So the map that you were describing essentially took the LAUSD school district boundaries, broke them out by individual school districts, school board member districts, and ranked which, actually we did it by quintiles, so the bottom 20% of schools that had the highest level of essentially disadvantage and had the highest number of challenges that would affect and depress essentially student learning outcomes. And so it was a mixed sort of model of including things like outcome variable around 3rd grade reading, 7th grade algebra, AP placements, high school graduation, but a lot of other sort of not traditional educational data around health and safety, the incidence of foster youth. And the strategy was essentially to vivify this data on a very hyper-local level. So when we did individual meetings with school board members, we had the LAUSD map as well as their individual board district map. And there's a sort of a recognition and almost moment of validation where a school board member says, oh, I know that rough part of my neighborhood. Yes, that makes sense that that's a bottom 20% school. They do need more resources. And what's interesting is it's localized enough of data that most school board members, even ones who might not necessarily have benefited as much from the distribution of funds, were very clear that I think some of the data that we were able to show, I'm sorry I don't have the data with me, but in the bottom 20%, the likelihood of being exposed to gun violence, for example, is something like 5 times in what it is in a higher performing, more affluent school. The likelihood of all of your, or not all, but a high percentage of your classmates not making it to high school graduation triples by the time that you go from a lowest 20% school to a highest 20% school. And so there was a way in which those are facts. You can have opinions and you can have facts, but the facts are not terribly disputable. And most people eventually got to a place of saying, look, we're all going to benefit from base grants. Everybody is getting a lift. But there was also a fair amount of data that we were able to bring out which showed that the schools that actually had been cut most severely during the years of the recession also were the schools that were in that bottom 20%, so it made a lot of sense to begin restoration in some of those schools first. The other thing that I should just mention is that there was, I think, also a very clear interest in figuring out how to restore things like English language specialists in a lot of places, to have early learning seats restored in places where it had been cut during the recession. It was a lot harder, I think, for people to get what I think is very obvious logic, but it was a lot harder of a sell to talk about using LCFF for PD and for improving teaching and learning. And that is a nut that we have yet to crack. But it was, I think, very powerful to have such a diverse group of constituents essentially on the same page.
I've seen, I know EdTrust West has done some similar work. Our reporting on EdSource has really identified real problems with the LCAP in terms of accessibility, transparency. The school board state board has made some changes, so I guess we can see how that plays itself out. But if there's sort of agreement that there's a problem with the LCAPs, shouldn't there be a concerted effort to really make it, fix these issues? Because I think that one of the things we don't want to be is 10 or 15 years down the road saying, you know what we should have done back in 2015 is made that LCAP more accessible and more understandable. Because we don't want to be 10 or 15 years down the road that the LCAP is another SARC, which, in case people forget, I say the school accountability report card. Those we're supposed to keep schools accountable. So how does one actually move the process forward?
It's a really good question, Louis, and I can duck it by saying it's beyond the scope of the research at the moment. But having said that, I think it would be unfair to damn the LCAP at this juncture. 6 months. Districts had 6 months. It's the first time out. It's a totally new process with a totally new budgeting system, a totally new finance formula. I think that's part of the big fear on the part of districts that we found in our research, that Chris expressed, that state, don't mess it up. Let's give it a little time. Now, will it be better the second time out? I think then we can start. If it's not, I think then we can begin to identify issues and work toward resolution. But I just would caution a little more patience with it because districts have had so little experience working with this and getting it right.
I'm hearing some things that, to me, have tension with each other. So I'm hearing back away from compliance, back away from oversight at this time. Let's move away from looking at issues of compliance. And yet I'm hearing the reports are showing that districts may have a tendency to not want to focus on the most disadvantaged groups and just say, let's give it to everyone. Or let's not look at, we have all this data, but let's just have the few at the top turn it into a plan. And so I'm seeing when we talk about hopes and fears, the fear that the very kids that were meant to benefit from this will not get what they need because we're going to back away from compliance, we're going to back away from giving any guidance or oversight because we're saying don't leave them alone. And what's going to happen over the next several years as the kids who are supposed to benefit are not receiving what they need out of the system. Do we really want to back away from oversight in addition to capacity building?
There is an accountability system on the way. And so I don't think it's accurate to say that we're backing away from compliance. I think what we were hearing from the districts was, this is hard, we need more time. Nobody was arguing that they shouldn't have an accountability system, that they shouldn't be held to the goals that they set for those kids, for the target groups. Will some districts not do a good job? Absolutely, no question about it. But for everyone that doesn't do a great job right away, there are districts out there that are really working hard to make this work. We didn't find any evil people out there, and there really was goodwill and well-meaning intention. So I remain optimistic about it, but the whole idea behind this is that the community is going to hold the district responsible. And so we take seriously this whole notion of meaningful public engagement. It's going to be right in everybody's face what happens. Did those kids do better? And the districts are going to be under pressure to do something.
Yeah, I was going to bring in the whole idea of subsidiarity too. I mean, it is local control, and I think for the last 13 years, accountability has been defined as teacher quality, and that's it. I think we need to get over that. I think teacher quality is important, but I think a lot of other folks need to be held accountable as well. And I think at the local level, I think the groups need to step up, and they need to kind of take this local control thing. And if they have an issue with it, go to the board, make some noise, organize, agitate. I mean, I think that's what needs to happen. I think people who are very comfortable in these structures that aren't working need to be made uncomfortable. I mean, the structure is not going to change unless it's uncomfortable and it's forced to change. So the whole idea of local control means that all these folks who are accountable to making sure that every kid has a right to a quality public education stand up and do something about it. And we can't just sit on our hands and say, well, Sacramento will fix it for us, because that usually doesn't work. I think it's time for us to stand up and for us to actually get something done at the local level, and I think that will be probably the best way to do it.